Panels, it will never be justified to punish developing countries for something they didn't even cause. So proud to propose. Now, some setup done. So first, for context, climate change is mostly caused and perpetuated by the developed countries ever since the Industrial Revolution, right? Which impacts both developed and developing countries because climate change is literally global. And with that said, they should instinctively have more accountability to solve this issue, not only because they literally have more power to do so, but also because they have more responsibility to do so. And our stance is that we tell you that developed countries should do more to fight climate change than poor countries. Now, moving on to my arguments then. First, about capability and capacity, and second, about accountability. First argument then. So, rich countries should take greater responsibility for fighting climate change because they have the capability and capacity, both in resources and technology, to make a larger and faster impact. And developed countries have strong economies, right? Advanced industries and also more stable governments. And this gives them the financial and technological advantages to actually implement large-scale climate solutions such as renewable energy and etc. Meanwhile, developing countries often struggle with their own problems and panels, we tell you that they already have a lot on their plate, like, and the problems may include like poverty, weak governance, and limited funding, meaning they just simply
Yo,
do
I.
not have the same ability to act the same scale or speed. And my DLO will be elaborating on this. And it is also unrealistic and unfair to expect poor countries to carry equal responsibility when they are still trying to meet their people's basic needs,
Yo,
such as
I.
security, healthcare, and education. Asking developing countries to invest heavily in climate policies could harm their own economic growth and worsen inequality. Therefore, rich countries, which already have the necessary systems and stability, should take on the heavier burden. Now, before moving on, yes, I'll take that POI.
Why can't poor countries help climate change in other ways, such as like other free solutions like planting trees or whatnot?
We're not saying that poor countries shouldn't like contribute at all. We're saying of course they should, right? But we're saying that rich countries should contribute more because again, they are the main cause, right? So that means they should like contribute more. And not only that, because they have the capability too. Meanwhile, poor countries, we tell you panels that they do not, okay? So moving on to my second argument then, which again is about accountability. Rich countries should do more to fight climate change because they are the main contributors to the problem and must take responsibility for their actions. It is deeply unfair that poor countries suffer the worst consequences of climate change, even though again they are not the main cause. For many years, developed countries have contributed the most to climate change, right? And these countries grew their economies while harming the planet. But now, panels, developing countries which have produced much less pollution are the ones facing the worst effects, right? They experience problems like floods, droughts, and food shortages, even though, again, they did not cause the problem. This just goes to show that the current situation is just unfair, right? The countries that caused the crisis are not the ones paying the price for it. That's why we tell you that developed countries must take accountability for their actions. For example, the US and European countries are responsible for over half of the total example of the total carbon emissions in history. But it's countries like Bangladesh, Kenya, and Maldives, and etc. that are being hit the hardest by rising sea levels and extreme weather. They don't, and the worst part is they don't even have enough money or technology to protect themselves. So this is why rich countries must take accountability because again, it's because this. Because in this case, climate change is really about fairness. Those who cause the problems should lead the way in fixing it. For all those reasons, then you must foreside proposition. Thank you.
Hello, I'm the LO to start off the opposition case. Yes, we have two arguments to tell you, but before I start, I'll first like to set up the debate. The propositions do more is like spending more money and having more technology, and rich countries having more. However, our team thinks that poor countries, even though they may have not much money, like the proposition says, but having equal responsibility can be explained in a different way. For example, our team's model is a model where rich countries spend money and like expensive technology and money. However, poor countries has a different job, like having solutions that are cost less, like planting trees or maybe having cheaper green uh, energy. Now moving on to my rebuttals. Our first rebuttal to the Prime Minister is about responsibility and capability. Rich countries are already doing so much. Like, for example, they created the Paris Agreement recently. Having more responsibility, like the prop, is telling them to create more backlash and unnecessary burden. This is this a world we no thank you. Developed nations are this is a world where developed nations are not motivated, and B, developing nations are also not doing much when they contribute to climate change. China, a developing country in many organizations standard, emit up to 34% of world emissions. Also, free riding. Poor countries may free ride on this support. If poor countries are suffering most, they shouldn't fight the hardest to save their own children instead of depending on others. Yes, this is because they are suffering. They must try to control their trouble themselves with accountability. Moving on to my two arguments. My first argument is about equal responsibility. The proposition mentioned that rich countries polluted more historically and in the past. Or we agree to this point that they may pollute it more by colonizing developing countries. However, as I mentioned in my rebuttal, these rich countries are already giving a lot of high technology things and already doing so much in the modern times. Uh, modern times. And in the modern day, developing countries is actually the one who are contributing the 2/3 of the overall carbon emissions. Poor countries should protect themselves and from the climate change they face themselves. This is true because most of them are still in the industrial era, focusing on mining things and mineral extraction, and factory processing and manufacture. B, most countries in the world are considered to be developing countries. This means that developing countries do in fact contribute pollution at quite a bit and should be required to help the harmful consequences. Moving on to my second argument. Uh, Larger impact. China provides about 89% of solar equipment in 2023, even though China is still considered a developing country. But how come they provided almost 90% of solar equipment? And also, very big examples of developing countries like Ethiopia and Kenya is also aiming for reforestation according to UN. I'm no more too proud to propose. I oppose. Thank you.
Panels, when you expect developing countries to pay and contribute to climate change while dealing with the problems inside their own borders because of climate change in itself, with the limited funds they have, opposition's case becomes unrealistic. We need to take advantage of and use developed countries' capacity, influence, and impact to truly achieve effectivity. I strongly propose, right? But now let me move on to my rebuttals. They talked about how poorer countries can contribute through cheaper initiatives. However, Judge, we tell you that we are not against poor countries contributing, and initiatives like this we do approve of. We just expect the developed and richer countries to contribute more because they're more accountable for it and because they have more capacity. Adding to that, cheaper initiatives like this will not contribute that much to the overall damage that we need to fix and doesn't do much for their case, as therefore to be noticeable development that would be expected under their side, they would need bigger funds and bigger allocation of money, right? But then moving on to the second clash, they talked about how most of the world is developing countries and that this means that developing countries also need to contribute a lot. However, Judge, we would like to again clarify that developing countries should contribute, but developed countries should contribute more. And we tell you that the amount of gas and damage they produce is not comparable to the amount that the developed countries have in the past, to the amount of gases that they've released in the past to get them to the developed stage that actually caused our climate change to be so bad right now, right? But now let me move on to my extension, which is about the influence and about the capacity. Judge, we tell you that it's not because the developed bigger countries are richer or have the technology, it's also because they have more influence and hold over the world. So what does this look like, right? This literally looks like if a developed and strong country, like let's say USA, for example, starts donating and putting funds into climate change, it'll lead and bring the other countries to actually start donating and helping too. It's about the influence that this developed countries hold and the power they have, right? This becomes essential for a problem like climate change. Why? Because of the reason that the climate change is a developing cumulative issue. The sooner we start, the better. And it's the influence from the bigger countries that essentially reels in the other countries to fully fight the harms of climate change, especially with the amount of required funds and sheer funds and effort we need. The developed countries literally have an obligation to lead and to start initiative. But now then, more on the capabilities that each countries themselves even have. As my PM has already mentioned, the little poorer and developing countries are the ones struck by climate change the most. They are vulnerable actors in this debate, and they're the ones that have to deal with most of the harms of climate change. Combined with the fact they don't even have much money or resources, then that they already have the obligation to take care of harms or climate change in their own areas. It becomes unrealistic to ask more funds from them and to expect them to give their maximum or even contribute as much as the other stable countries would in their side of the house, right? Because side opposition cannot just ignore the problems that developing countries have in their own problems, in their own borders. These problems are real, and these problems are the reasons that they are being restricted. And it's really unfair because again, as my PM has mentioned, it's the developed countries that's really so much gas in the past to get them to this developed state that make climate change so bad in our status quo. And the developing countries are already facing punishment for it. They already have to face their own problems in their border. Why would they expect the developing countries to even give more? And do they even have the capacity to? We tell you no. But then there also arises a problem when you're pinning every single country for the same responsibility, where there would be constant nitpicking and countries would go, oh, but it's unfair. I only contribute this, and no actual progress would be achieved either way. Because when you're pinning every country for the same responsibility, nitpicking would never stop, and the countries would not want to share the burden. For all these reasons, I strongly propose.
Judge, your neighborhood is on fire, and government is telling us to wait for our rich neighbor to come and save us all. But here's the truth. Your house is going to burn out before they'll return, and they'll save your house first before even thinking about yours. Becoming reliant only provides instability for these poor countries. Now, before moving on to the final argument, the opposition side, starting off with basic rebuttals to the government point. So they said that it lacks significant impact if it's done by developing countries, because developing countries are poor and lack ability. So even if these here's the point, even if developing and developed countries have equal responsibility, developed countries already help significantly, even if it's a 50-50 split. So why not give the chance for the developing countries to develop, find their ways to improve their environmental problems, and do the best in their role to solve this problem on their own? Because being reliant on that, the developing countries are the most vulnerable stakeholders in this debate, right? Because they're poor and they don't lack ability and they have a lot of environmental problems inside their country. But if we're really thinking about what's going to be best for these vulnerable stakeholders, it's letting them fend on their own, because because the US, Germany, etc., they won't always be there to support. And especially that's true, for example, with the example of Trump, which involved America stepping out of things such as the Paris Agreement. Well, Paris Agreement, what if Paris Agreement, what happened to the countries that relied on America for the environmental support? What are going to happen to them without their support? And maybe another country can help for now, but in the long term, they need to learn to rely on no one but themselves to actually find stability in the long term. Now, their main point was about responsibility, but here's the thing: China, a developing country by many standards of organizations, emits up to 34% of world emissions. India is one of the most polluted countries in the world. They impact climate change. Yes, America, Germany, etc., have emitted more in the historical sense, and we agree that they should hold responsibility. But not all of these necessarily more than poor countries, because they already invest in green energy, spread awareness, and etc., and do the best they can to fight climate change. And imagine your brother ate 40 cookies last year, but he's trying to resist his cookie temptations this year. You didn't eat a lot of cookies last year, but you're eating 3 cookies per week this year. Even though historically your brother ate more cookies, you and your brother hold equal responsibility, as both of you ate a lot of cookies. The only change is the difference of time when you ate more cookies. In the end, both of you ate a lot of cookies, and both of you hold responsibility for the cookie consumption. Now, For the caps, now moving on the capacity and capability. Yes, we agree that they have capacity and capability, but they're doing it right now. They already do enough, and we're not saying that we will ban them from participating. They will still hold 50-50 responsibility. And for the most recent argument about influence, yes, the USA, Germany, etc., are influential, but the problem is that this isn't always good influence. For example, the US does a good thing. Okay, I'll join the Paris Agreement too. But for example, what if the US leaves the Paris Agreement? They have no incentive to stay in that anymore. So it will lead to actual worse influence if these larger countries do a wrong action, and it leads to over-reliance. Now moving on to the final argument of opposition side about developed countries already doing enough. Developing countries, and especially primarily citizens, have been doing more than developing countries in terms of fighting global warming. Examples include international treaties such as the Paris Agreement, where many countries around the world gather to fight the problem of climate change. The rich countries are often found or play a main role in these treaties or other attempts at fighting climate change. This is done by the government's money, gathered by a portion of taxes from the citizens. Why is this true? They have more education and awareness, and they have enough capital to make significant eco-friendly decisions. We agree with this. However, if these countries continue to take more and more taxes from their citizens, help these poor countries, since poor countries have a smaller role in the government side, this will lead to backlash within the country and opposition of the cause, and they might think badly about the poor countries that they're not fighting it and seemingly only taking their taxes away, even if this is not true it seems like this on surface, and it seems like this from the citizens' standpoint. This will lead to instability for both the rich and poor countries, as the rich country is filled with opposition and poor country doesn't know when the rich country will stop helping them, thus slowing the process of fighting climate change. Proud to oppose.
Change has come to the extremity where it doesn't even matter who started it, but who's going to stabilize it, or even better, stop it. We tell you that this debate isn't just about responsibility and accountability, it's also about who can do more, should do more. Proud to propose. Clarification and strategic mistakes then. Side opposition said that poorer countries should fend themselves and not be reliant or dependent on other countries. But just from this point itself, it shows how opposition doesn't even capture the essence of this debate. It's not about being reliant or rich countries fixing poor countries' problems. This debate is about which solution can fix climate change more. And note that climate change is a global issue, and it's not an issue that only affects the developing countries. Developed countries will also eventually face these issues, but they're also facing it now. So it's literally not a question of reliance, it's a question of global contribution. Moving on to my clashes then. Firstly, developing nations can help in cheap ways, like using cheap energy and planting trees, like for example, green energy. Panels, I think that from the very point that side opposition said this argument, it is clear that they do not understand the state of developing countries. The very reason they're called developed is because they simply cannot efficiently use their money to use green energy, and it's too expensive for them. And they have more larger scale internal problems to solve, like for example, poverty or severe hunger or like famine or like low economic rates, right? And we're not saying that developing nations should not help with climate change. Yes, they should help. We agree on that. They can like plant trees or use even better green or technology, like stuff like that, right? And they can help with climate change. We're supporting the fact that they should help climate change because they can. But we are saying that developed countries should help more because they have the more capacity to do so, and they also have more responsibility to do so. We win this clash then. Moving on to my second clash about how the developing countries have contributed to 2/3 of the global climate change, so they have more accountability and responsibility, and not developed nations. First of all, this statement isn't even true, right? It's actually the wealthiest, the elites, 10% of people globally who are responsible for 2/3 of global warming since 1990. And the largest share of historical cumulative emissions comes from a few large economies, which are now a mix of developed and developing countries. But while emissions are rising in many developing countries, particularly like in Asia, they account for a way smaller portion of historical emissions and a smaller share of current total emissions compared to major economies like the US or like the EU and China. But secondly, let's take it to the point that for our burden, and let me prove to you why we still win under this case. It's simple. developed countries have more capacity to fix climate change. Look, even LO stated that developed countries have contributed to a lot to climate change because they have more more modern and futuristic technology to use. So they have tried more because, as we can see, the issue has not even been fixed. It's worsening, affecting most countries like Indonesia, a developing country. And we tell you that just because developed countries have already contributed a lot, it does not mean that they shouldn't do more. Everyone is getting affected by it. So if you can solve it, why wouldn't you? Developed countries literally have more capacity to help climate change, and developing countries have more internal and severe problems that developed countries experience less. For example, like high percentages of poverty and low quality of life and standard of living. Moving on to my weighing then. Aside proposition, of course, they get both countries and both types of countries, developing and developed, to help climate change. But on our side, that also exists. So that's why we win this debate. And on side opposition, on our side, what do we get? Firstly, more global influence that eventually leads to more countries wanting to contribute because of the domino effect. And secondly, more responsibility and accountability that leads to equality. And third, chances of climate change being solved in a way where countries do not deteriorate and lose too much money just to fund for the stabilization of climate change are increased. So we have one under three metrics. First, accountability. Secondly, climate change being solved more fastly. And third, efficiency and a faster ride to the stabilization of climate change. So if side op wants to win, they have to prove the harms of not making developed countries contribute more to climate change, because till now, we side prop has consistently proven that since developing countries can help more, they should. But it doesn't mean that developing countries cannot help. On the basis of the debate and climate change and the condition of poor countries, we are so proud to propose. Thank you.
If you are drowning in the ocean, would you wait for people to save you, or would you rather swim yourself and go to somewhere you can survive on your own? Josh, poor countries are the people who are drowning right now, and we believe that they should fend for themselves and try to save themselves first. Two things in my speech. First, some clarifications, and then moving on to the clashes of today's debate. So some clarifications. Even if asking these poor countries is unfair, because asking poor countries to work when they didn't actually cause the problem, as proposition talks about, we believe that this debate is not about fairness in climate change, and it's more about survival. The status quo is a world where climate change is one of the biggest issues. Even if poor countries didn't cause it, at least they should put in some amount of money, because they are the ones who are suffering the most, right? So what is proposition saying? They're saying that we should have a 70 and 30% a support with the rich countries leading in climate change solutions. This leads to over-reliance. Even if proposition says it's not about reliance, we believe that in the long term this will be a bad thing. Yes.
So you said that developing countries should fix themselves and not be dependent on developed countries, but we're not saying that developing countries should be realigned. It's just that they do not have enough capacity to fix themselves. They are helping, but they need external help.
We understand your concern on how these developing countries, they don't really have the capacity to help, but we actually think they do. They can do these very cheap solutions, making better places to fix and have better eco-friendly solutions, which in the long term can lead to better economy, which I will explain in my class. So we believe that 50-50 is responsibility is much better, because first, no thank you, because first it leads to a much more better economy for them. And even if there are many other harms that proposition talks about, I'll be rebutting all of that in my class on my class on how who has more responsibility and actually wants that responsibility, right? Just having wanting to have this responsibility is crucial too, because if we don't really want this responsibility, then there's no proper incentive, right? So what does proposition say? They say that the developed countries put in more historical input first, and they have more power and money in order to afford these solutions, right? As our previous speaker said, first, rich countries are already doing so much and their citizens have backlash. Having more responsibility, like Prop is telling them to do, creates backlash and unnecessary burden on them. Is this the world where we want? A, developing nations are unmotivated, and B, developing nations are also not doing as much compared to our world when they contribute at least a lot to climate change. So clearly you can see that rich countries, even if we are being charitable, rich countries don't even want to. Even if propositions state that rich nations have responsibility, they cannot have a big incentive. And look at America and the Paris Agreement and the UN SDGs. What does proposition mean? Rich countries like solution don't work along. Second, proposition says that poor countries are in danger. However, we believe that here's the thing though. We believe that fighting climate change improves the economy because, like, for instance, planting trees helps survival, which provides food, shade, flood protection, etc. We see that all nations should have equal responsibility because this means there's an incentive to grow their economy and have like more eco-friendly architecture and whatnot, and therefore they can like use these opportunities to build the other nations' trust. For example, I can create a good eco-friendly tech and grow bigger and have more support. So actually, you have some incentive to like grow their economy through this, right? And also, as both sides agree, poor nations want to grow and earn trust and support, so they will want to have this responsibility. Proposition then argues basic fairness is who requires those who cause damage to repair it. Since rich countries broke the planet, they should fix it. Their analysis wants fairness over survival for the ones who suffer the most. Yes, this sounds fair, but when the broken thing is on fire and killing people right now, this is a metric of urgency. You can't just wait for the person who broke it to fix it. You should get some water and start fixing it by yourself, even if you don't have the resources to do it, and that is why we are so proud to oppose.
I'll first likely to do the world comparison between the proposition and the opposition. Proposition is a world where rich countries has to do more financially because they just did historically, but they already paid it and did so much to do the historical benefits, which causes a backlash to their own citizens, forcing them to pay more taxes and making their citizens saying, why do we have to pay more? We already paid a lot to fix this solution. Well, this is the proposition world. While the opposition's world is a world where the developing countries does fight for climate change with equal responsibility with the rich countries. This doesn't mean that they're gonna pay the same financial things, however, but splitting parts to do their own job. For example, planting trees to solve these air pollutions, or maybe doing cheap green things. For example, maybe solar panels. Solar panel doesn't cost that much. The opposition world is way better because these rich countries, developed countries, and the proposition world gets angry because they have to pay more tax even though they did a lot in the past. While the opposition world, our world, is equal, and the citizens of the rich countries doesn't have to pay more and rather paying the equal amount right now and having both countries happy like these. If as our opposition web speaker said, if they do more equal stuff, I mean eco-friendly things, they'll get more trust, which is good both for the poor country and the rich countries. And I'm no more too proud to oppose. Thank you.
Opposition lost this debate the moment they assumed that developing countries are as capable as the developed countries to combat climate change. So proud to propose. Now, some strategic mistakes then. First, the opposition just can't understand our point of developed countries being the main contributor to climate change, but developing countries are the ones suffering the most. They also can't understand that we're not saying developing countries shouldn't contribute at all. We're simply saying that developed countries should do more than them. But then also, throughout this entire debate, the opposition's stand has been unclear. Do they want equal contribution? Do they want developing countries to do more? Their stance and speeches have been blurry and unstable. They talked about how developing countries can grow trees and etc. However, this then clashes with the stance of wanting equal contribution because planting a few trees do not equal to the contribution that developed countries are contributing and will be contributing. And we've also said multiple times that we do not want contributions from developing countries. We just want developed countries to do more. And so moving on then, we posit that rich countries have both the capability and capacity to truly combat climate change, and they also have to take accountability for it. And their response was that poor countries can contribute to cheaper initiatives. But why do we win this clash then? We win this clash because our side shows fairness. And moreover, this debate is not just about ability, it's also about responsibility. And next, they told you that we should give developing countries a chance to contribute as well. They also said that developing countries shouldn't be dependent or overly reliant on the developed countries. But panels, this is not enough because from the very get-go, we're not saying developing countries shouldn't contribute. Of course they should, right? And if they want to, then go ahead. No one is stopping them. But what we're saying is that developed countries should do more. The reason is very, very simple. They are more capable and accountable. And panels, our side isn't saying that developing countries should completely rely on rich ones. Support from developed countries is not about fairness and responsibility. Support from developed countries is about fairness and responsibility, not being overly dependent. And panels, at the end of the day, it is clear that side opposition doesn't have a stable stance, and it's not even understanding the state of developing countries, because this debate isn't about reliance, it's about which side is able to help climate change the most. And obviously, the current status quo is on side opposition side. That's why climate change issue isn't improving. And plus, the reason why in the status quo the developing countries are still so behind in modern technology, are in fact not able to build green infrastructure, is because they are developing. So for all those reasons, then you must vote for side proposition. Thank you.